Hey everyone! Welcome to today's video lecture. Today we will be talking about the general writing principles of delivering negative messages. So we will be covering the different types and the reasons for using the indirect and the direct approaches when writing a negative message, as well as the formatting of these messages. So to get started, let's look at some strategies for delivering bad news. I'm sure we've all heard bad news before, and we might have different ways that we would like to be told something that's bad. Some people might like to be told right away. Some people would rather have it broken to them gently, so to speak. And this aspect may be cultural as well. But we're going to look at how you should approach dealing with negative messages here in the Canadian workplace. So in all businesses, things can occasionally go wrong, and this might happen when goods are not delivered, a product doesn't perform the way it was expected to, service was poor, billing was late or incorrect, customers misunderstood warranties, all sorts of things. So because bad news disappoints people, sometimes it irritates people and it might even anger the receiver. You have to be careful about how you write these things. So the bad feelings associated with disappointing news can generally be reduced if the reader knows the reason for the rejection and the bad news is revealed with sensitivity. So you've probably heard people say sometimes that it wasn't the news that really bothered them, it was how they were told. That's what we're going to talk about. So many writers do use the indirect pattern or indirect approach when they're delivering these negative messages in a business context. The indirect strategy is especially appealing to relationship-oriented writers, so people who care about how their message is going to affect the receiver and if that relationship is going to be maintained after they receive this message. So the focus here is to apply techniques for breaking the bad news sensitively while refusing routine requests and claims, breaking bad news to customers, and delivering bad organizational news to employees. So establishing goals and communicating bad news. These are 4 important points to be thinking about when you're writing a bad news letter. So delivering bad news is not the happiest task that you will have, but it can be gratifying if you do it effectively. You can still be proud of your work. So as a business communicator, working with bad news, you will have many goals. There will be different reasons you're writing these letters. But the goals you should focus on, the things that are really important, are acceptance, a positive image, message clarity, and protection. So in acceptance, you want to make sure that the reader understands and will accept the bad news. The indirect pattern will help achieve this. With a positive image, you want to promote and maintain a good image of yourself and the company that you're working for the person receiving the letter. Realizing this goal assumes you're going to act ethically. Now, message clarity is of course important. You need to make the message clear so that additional information is not required and you do not get a follow-up message from people saying, oh yeah, we received it, but we really didn't understand. And protection. You need to avoid creating liability or responsibility for you or your organization. So be aware that anything you write on company letterhead is considered a legal document. So be careful what you're writing. We're not always successful in achieving these 4 goals, but it is possible, and there are strategies that you can use to achieve these. And of course, the main thing is using the indirect approach. This helps prepare your reader. So whereas the good news might be delivered quickly, where you say, congratulations, you have been accepted to, or congratulations, you have won, or great news, we're having a sale. As much as the good news we like to hear right away, the bad news is generally easier to accept when it's broken to you gently and gradually. So So front loading is not a thing here. You have your explanation first and then your reasons. And then the bad news. So revealing bad news slowly and indirectly shows sensitivity to your reader. And by preparing them, you can soften the impact. So a blunt announcement of disappointing news might cause the receiver to stop reading and just toss the message aside. The indirect strategy enables you to keep the reader's attention until you've been able to explain the reasons for the bad news. The most important part of bad news letter writing is the explanation. All right, so using the direct pattern does happen sometimes in specific instances, which we'll look at here. So many bad news letters are best organized indirectly, beginning with a buffer for the reader and giving the reasons and explanations. The direct pattern with bad news first can be more effective sometimes in situations like when the receiver may overlook the bad news. So considering all of the mail, emails, things we get these days, many readers just skim messages. They don't look through it thoroughly. So if they don't find substantial material there or anything of interest, then they'll just toss it aside and they won't see it. You need to put the bad news in the front sometimes when you really need to catch the reader's attention right away. Another time to use the direct pattern would be when organization policy suggests directness. So some companies do expect all internal messages and announcements, whether they be good or bad news, to be straightforward and presented clearly and right away. Another time might be when the receiver prefers directness. So a manager, for example, might prefer directness. Shorter messages enable the reader to get in the proper frame of mind immediately, and if you suspect that the reader prefers the facts be presented right away, then use the direct approach. Another time you might use this is when firmness is necessary. So messages that must demonstrate determination and strength should not use delaying techniques. For example, the last in a series of collection letters that seeks payment of an overdue account may require a direct opening. When the bad news isn't damaging, you could start with the direct pattern. So if the bad news is insignificant, such as a small increase in cost, then it doesn't personally affect the receiver, then the direct strategy might work. It might make sense to use that here. And you might also use it when the receiver's goodwill is not an issue. So rarely a business may have to send a message rejecting a customer's business. For instance, if a chain of retail stores sent letters to two sisters, let's say, announcing that their business is no longer welcome. Maybe these people have a history of returning items all the time and complaining about service, then you might not care so much if you lose their business. Thinking through the entire writing process is especially important when you're writing bad news. Not only do you want the receiver to understand and accept your message, but you want to be careful that your words say only what you're intending to say. So, ways to help you achieve this, there are 3 phases that we're going to look at. So phase 1 is analysis, anticipation, and adaptation. So in phase 1, which is the pre-writing phase, you need to analyze the bad news so that you can anticipate its effect on the receiver. If the disappointment is hopefully mild, then you can announce the bad news directly. Again, a small increase in something, or maybe you're not concerned with the person's feelings, or when firmness definitely is necessary. If the bad news is serious or personal, consider techniques to reduce the impact of the message. So adapt your words to protect the receiver's ego and their feelings, really. So instead of saying you neglected to change the oil, causing severe damage to the engine, which is super serious, you could use the passive voice. So this is definitely a way to approach negative messages. So in the passive voice, you can say the oil wasn't changed, causing severe damage to the engine. Whoops. Which one would you rather hear if you made the mistake? Or which one would you rather read? Probably the second one. It reduces the impact. So choose words that show that you respect your reader to be a responsible and a valuable person to you. Yes, you might be angry and you want to say some nasty words, but if you want to maintain some kind of relationship with them, especially professionally, be careful how you say what you want to say. Now, phase 2 is research, organization, and composition. I'm just going to move this down. Okay, phase 2. So in phase 2, this is your writing phase. So you can gather information and brainstorm ideas, jot down all the reasons that you have that explain the bad news. So if 4 or 5 reasons prompted your negative decision, then concentrate on the strongest one, or the safest one, so to speak. Avoid presenting any weak reasons to the reader, because if you have that, they might see it like a loophole and they'll approach you later and say, well, this isn't a good enough reason. So stick to the strongest, most important, the ones that really helped you make that decision, the ones that really influenced your decision. And after selecting your best reasons, outline the 4 parts of the indirect approach. So the buffer, the reasons, the bad news, and then your closing. And phase 3 is revision, proofreading, and evaluation. So in phase 3, of course, this is where you're revising. So you're ready to switch positions and put yourself in the receiver's shoes now. Have you looked at the problem from their perspective? Is your message too blunt? Is it too subtle? Does the message make the refusal or the denial or the bad news announcement clear? These are important things to think about after you've written your bad news and to review about your letter before you send it. Prepare your final version, proofread it, format, punctuation, correctness of the message, and making sure that you've done all these things. Also, as a reminder, be careful to look for legal issues that might occur, might exist. Remember to avoid these legal problems. So, before looking at the components of a bad news message, we're going to look more closely at how you can avoid exposing yourself or the employer to legal liability when you write these negative messages. So, although we can't always anticipate the consequences our words will have, we should avoid libel and defamation, careless language, and misrepresenting our organization. All right, so you don't want to be guilty of libel or defamation. Calling people names can get you into trouble. Defamation is the legal term for any false statement that harms an individual's reputation. And when this language is written, it's called libel. And when it's spoken, it's considered slander. So be very careful, especially when you're upset about something and you're writing a letter that might be very emotional for you. To be actionable or things likely to result in a lawsuit, abusive language must be false and damaging to one's good name, and it must be published. So what that means is that it needs to be spoken within the presence of other people, or it needs to be written. So if you're alone with someone and you accuse them of accepting bribes in the company, they can't sue you because the defamation wasn't published. Nobody heard you. Their reputation wasn't damaged. But if anyone else overhears these words, or if you wrote them down, even in an email, even in a text message, you might be legally liable. So be very careful what you say to people at work and what you write. You may also be prosecuted and lose your job If you transmit a harassing or a libelous message by email or posting this message in a chat room, a message board, or even on your own private blog. So electronics transmissions, are considered published, even when they're private. So a company may incur liability for messages sent through their computer system from employees. So even if you sent it, the company might be liable. And that's why many companies choose to monitor outgoing and incoming emails. So whether things are in print or electronic, competent communicators will avoid making unproven charges and letting their emotions prompt abusive language. You don't want to misrepresent your organization. Most of us hate to have to reveal bad news. We don't like to be the bad guy most of the time. To make ourselves look better and to make the receiver feel better, of course, to maintain these good relations, we're tempted to make statements that might actually be legally dangerous. So business communicators act as agents of the organization. Their words, their decisions, and opinions are assumed to represent those of the organization. If you want to communicate your personal feelings or opinions, use your personal email address or write it on paper without the company letterhead. And sign your name without your title or your affiliation. Volunteering extra information can also lead to trouble. Avoid supplying data that can be misused and avoid making promises that can't be fulfilled. Don't admit or imply responsibility for conditions that caused damage or that caused injury. Even apologies, things like "we're sorry the faulty bottle cap damaged your carpet," can suggest liability. So now let's finally look at those techniques for delivering bad news. All right. There is a 4-part indirect pattern for delivering the bad news, which I mentioned earlier, having the buffer, the reasons, the bad news, and the closing. And now we're going to look at that. So first part is the buffer. You offer a neutral but meaningful statement that doesn't mention the bad news. Then you have the reasons. You give an explanation of the causes for the bad news before you disclose what it is. Then, of course, there is the bad news. You need to provide a clear but understated announcement of the bad news that may include an alternative or a compromise. And then your closing, where you need to include a personalized, forward-looking, a pleasant statement for your reader. In this pattern, the bad news is delayed until after all the explanations have been given. The 4 components of the indirect pattern are here. So, buffer, you could use the best news, give a compliment, show appreciation, give or show agreement, state facts, show your understanding, or apologize. Then you have your reasons, which could be cautious explanations, company policy, explanation, positive words, evidence that the matter was fairly considered and that they're taking it seriously as well. Then you have your bad news, which could be delivered as an embedded placement using the passive voice, which we looked at earlier about the oil, an implied refusal, compromise, or an alternative. And in your closing, you could be forward-looking, you can give information about an alternative, give good wishes, talk about free things, talk about the resale value or the resale of something, or give a sales promotion. So let's look at these each in turn. All right. Buffering. All right. A buffer is a device that you can use to reduce shock or pain. To buffer the pain of the bad news, begin with a neutral but a meaningful statement that makes the reader want to continue reading, or at least will continue reading. The buffer should be relevant and concise and provide a natural transition to the explanation that follows. The individual situation, of course, will help determine what you should put in the buffer. Avoid things like, thanks for your letter. That's not personalized and might not have much to do with the actual situation. So, some openings you can use. Start with the best news. So start with the part of the message that represents the best news. For example, a message to workers announcing that new healthcare rules limit prescriptions to 34-day supply and that they're going to be increasing co-payments. With home delivery, however, employees can save up to $24 on each prescription that they fill. So to emphasize this good news but still get ready to deliver the bad news, you might start with something like, you can now get significant savings and avoid trips to the drugstore by having your prescriptions delivered to your home. Whoops. Sounds nice. It's a decent opening before they tell us that we're going to have a limit and the price is going up. You could also start with a compliment. Praise the receiver's accomplishments, the organization, or the efforts that have been shown. But do so honestly and sincerely. For instance, in a letter declining an invitation to speak somewhere, you could say something like, the Thalians have my sincere admiration for their fundraising projects on behalf of hungry children. I am honored that you asked me to speak on Friday, November 3rd. Whoops. And then later in your letter, you would explain that this is great, but unfortunately you cannot attend. Okay, showing appreciation is also a great way to start. So you can convey thanks to the reader for doing business with you, for sending you something, or conveying confidence in your organization. Maybe they expressed some feelings or provided feedback for you. These are all good things. So focus on that. Appreciate. Suppose you had to draft a letter that refuses their employment, though, because they've applied. You might say something like, I appreciated learning about the hospitality management program, at Algonquin College, and about your qualifications in our interview last Wednesday. And then you would, talk about, but unfortunately, we don't have a position for you right now. Avoid thanking your reader for something that you're about to refuse, okay? So in this appreciation section, it's really hard not to say thank you for sending your feedback, or thank you for expressing your feelings, or thank you for telling me about yourself in the interview. Avoid doing that because you're about to refuse something and people might misinterpret or misunderstand what you're really trying to say when you thank them and then refuse them. So you can still be polite and nice and gentle, but just be very careful about thanking people when you're going to refuse something. You can also agree, so make a relevant statement with which both the reader and receiver can agree, so you and them. A letter that rejects a loan, for instance, might be something like, we both realize how much the export business has been affected by the relative weakness of the dollar in the past 2 years. So this is something you can both, when the reader sees this, they'll be like, yeah, I guess, okay, I understand, I'll try again later. So you can see how this approach might, again, soften the bad news. Then they're starting with facts. So provide objective information that introduces the bad news. For example, in a memo that might announce cutbacks in the hours of the employee cafeteria, you might say, during the past 5 years, the number of employees, eating breakfast in our cafeteria has dropped from 32% to 12%. That's a huge drop. And starting with those numbers, you know, when people read stuff, they're attracted to numbers. They'll look there right away. This is a good way to start, and you're providing things again that people can agree with, especially if they're one of those people who don't go anymore or go still and they're like, yeah, there's nobody here. Okay, you could also start with showing understanding. So show that you care about your reader. Notice here that this is a letter that started with an announcement to the customer about a product defect. So they've put, we know that you expect superior performance from all the products that you purchase from Office City. That's why we're writing personally about the program about the program. Look at the wrong example. Okay, that is why we are writing to you personally to talk to you about the program that you recently purchased. And there's apology. So a carefully worded apology may be appropriate. If you do apologize, do it early, do it briefly, and just sincerely get it over with. For example, a manufacturer of super premium ice cream might respond to a customer's complaint with something like, we're genuinely sorry that you were disappointed in the price of the ice cream that you recently purchased at one of our scoop shops. Your opinion is important to us, and we appreciate your giving us the opportunity to look into the problem you described. Good buffers will avoid revealing the bad news immediately. Moreover, they do not convey a false impression that good news will follow. Additionally, they provide a natural transition to the next bad news letter component, which are the reasons. So, presenting the reasons. All right. So the most important part of a bad news letter is the section that explains why a negative decision was necessary. So without sound reasoning for denying a request or refusing a claim, then the letter will fail. No matter how cleverly it was organized or how well written it will fail if it does not provide reasons. So one study found actually that if managers offered coworkers good reasons for the bad news, then employees were 43% less likely to experience anger, to blame people, or to feel stressed about it. So, as part of planning before writing, you need to analyze your problem. If you decide to refuse a request, you should have specific reasons why. Before disclosing the bad news, try to explain those reasons to the reader. Providing an explanation reduces the feelings of ill will and improves the chances that the reader will actually accept the bad news. All right, so ways to present your reasons. One way is to be cautious in your explanation. So if the reasons are not confidential and if they will not create legal liability, you can be specific. For example, growers supplied us with a limited number of patio roses, and our demand this year, let's move this down. Our demand this year was twice that of last year. Okay, so we can be specific. We can say, look, we needed more. If you're refusing to speak at an engagement, for example, then you can say that the date didn't work for you. You can be very clear. Another technique for presenting your reasons might be citing reader or other benefits, if plausible, citing reader benefits. Okay, so readers are more open to bad news if in some way, even indirectly, it might help them. In refusing a customer's request for free hemming of skirts and slacks, this company wrote, "We tested our ability to hem skirts a few months ago. This process proved to be very time consuming. We've decided not to offer this service because the additional cost would have increased the selling price of the skirts substantially, and we did not want to impose that cost on all of our customers. So you're telling the customer no, but you might make them feel better about it. Like, oh, okay, at least I didn't have to pay more for the skirt. Readers will also accept bad news better if they recognize that someone or something else will benefit, such as other workers or the environment. So you might say something like, although we would like to consider your application, we prefer to fill managerial positions from within. So people might accept this a little easier, knowing that, well, okay, somebody else got the job. Somebody else still got to, work, for example. Avoid trying to show reader benefits, though, if they appear insincere. Something like, to improve our service to you, we're increasing our brokerage fees. Like, come on, who wants to hear that? All right, you can explain the company policy. So readers resent blanket policy statements that prohibit something. For example, company policy prevents us from making cash refunds, or contract bids may be accepted from local companies only. Or even something like, company policy requires us to promote from within. People don't like hearing these blanket statements. So instead of hiding behind these policies from your reader, you could gently explain why the policy makes sense. Something like, we prefer to promote from within because it rewards the loyalty of our employees. In addition, we found that people who are familiar with our organization make the quickest contribution or amalgamation to our team efforts and into the team. So explain the company policies. Even when you're going for the blanket policy, try to explain it to the reader. You can choose positive words, so to keep the reader in a receptive mood, you can be positive, because the words that you use definitely affect the reader's response. Remember that the objective in the indirect pattern is to hold the reader's attention until you've had a chance to explain the reasons that will justify the bad news. So to keep them in this receptive mood, you need to avoid expressions with punitive, demoralizing, or otherwise negative connotations. Stay away from words that are negative, such as cannot, claim, denied, error, failure, fault, impossible, mistaken, misunderstood, never, regret, rejected, unable, unwilling, unfortunately, and violate. These are all words we don't want to hear. So try to stay in the positive realm using positive words. Another technique is showing that the matter was treated seriously and fairly. So in explaining your reasons, demonstrate to the reader that you took the matter seriously, that you do take it seriously. You've investigated and you are making an unbiased decision. Consumers are more accepting of disappointing news when they feel that their requests have been heard and that they've been treated fairly. Avoid passing the buck or blaming others, especially within your own organization. Such unprofessional behavior makes the reader lose faith in your company and other services that you may have been able to provide them if you had kept the relationship. So the next step is to cushion your bad news. So although you can't prevent the disappointment that bad news will bring, you can reduce the pain somewhat by breaking the news sensitively. Be especially considerate when the reader will suffer personally from this bad news. A number of thoughtful techniques can cushion this blow. Things like positioning the bad news strategically. So what does this mean? Okay, instead of spotlighting it, sandwich the bad news between other sentences, perhaps amongst your own reasons. Try not to let the refusal begin or end the paragraph, because the reader's eyes will linger on what starts and what finishes. Not to mention, they're more likely to remember what came first and what came last. So the sandwich thing is like how we give feedback, right? So sandwich your bad news. Another technique that reduces the shock is putting a painful idea in a subordinate clause. Something like, although another candidate was hired, we appreciate your interest in our organization and we wish you every success in your job search. So they started with the and then ended with something a little more positive. Subordinate clauses often begin with words like although, as, because, if, and since. To cushion the bad news, you might also use the passive voice, which we've seen. So passive voice verbs enable you to depersonalize the action. Whereas the active voice will focus the attention on the person, the passive voice will highlight the action. So things like we don't give cash refunds versus cash refunds are not given because blah, blah, blah. You can use the passive voice for bad news, and in some instances, you can combine the passive voice with a subordinate clause. For example, although franchise scoop shop owners cannot be required to lower their ice cream prices, we're happy to pass along your comments for their consideration. You can also accentuate the positive. So messages are far more effective when you describe what you can do instead of what you can't do. Most people do not want to hear no. And if they do have to hear no, then they want to know what's coming next. What can you do for me if you can't do that? So rather than saying we will no longer allow credit card purchases, you might try, we're now selling gasoline at discounted cash prices. So show them what you can do, what is available for them. Now, you can also imply the refusal. It is sometimes possible to avoid a direct statement of refusal. In this refusal to contribute to a charity, for example, the writer here never actually said no. Because we will soon be moving into new offices in Glendale, all our funds are earmarked for relocation costs. We hope that next year we'll be able to support your worthwhile charity. So we understand that they're not going to be supporting us this year, but they never actually said no. The danger of using an implied refusal is that it's too subtle for the reader to understand. Be certain that you make the bad news clear and prevent the need for further correspondence. And another thing you can use is suggesting a compromise or an alternative. So a refusal is not so depressing if a suitable compromise, substitute, or an alternative is available. So in denying permission to a group of students to visit a historical private residence, this writer softened the bad news by proposing an alternative for them. They said, although private tours of the grounds are not given, we do open the house and its gardens for one charitable event in the fall. So implying they can come back later. You can further reduce the impact of the bad news by refusing to dwell on it. Present it briefly or just imply it and then move on to your closing. So let's look at the closing. After explaining the bad news sensitively, close the message with a pleasant statement that promotes goodwill and will continue to foster the relationship you have with the person you're writing to. The closing should be personalized, and it may include a forward look, an alternative, good wishes, something free, resale information, or an off-the-subject remark. So let's check these out. Forward look. Anticipate future relations and business with this person. A letter that refuses a contract might say something like this. Thank you for your bid. We look forward to working with your talented staff when future projects demand your special expertise. So in other words, we're not working with you now, but we will consider calling you later. Not too bad. Okay, present an alternative. Let's move this down. If an alternative exists, end your letter with that, with the follow-through advice. For example, in a letter that rejected a customer's demand for replacement of a landscaped plant, you could say something like, I'll be happy to give you a free inspection and a consultation, so please call me at this number to arrange a date for my visit, but I am not replacing the plant. Right? I'll come over and look at your garden, but I'm not replacing the plant because I don't know what you did to it. You can also use good wishes. So if you're rejecting a job candidate, for example, you can say something like, we appreciate your interest in our company, and we extend to you our best wishes in your search to find the perfect match between your skills and your job requirements. Now, This to me sounds a little bit fluffy. It might be a little much unless you know the person. So do be careful that your good wishes don't sound insincere or snarky because you use too many words. All right, freebies, which is slang for something free. All right, so when customers complain, primarily about a food product or small consumer items, companies will often send them coupons or samples of something else, maybe even a gift. And this can restore confidence and promote future business. So in response to a customer's complaint about a frozen dinner, you could write something like, "Your loyalty and your concern about our frozen entrees is genuinely appreciated because we want you to continue enjoying our healthful and our convenient dinners. We're enclosing a coupon that you can take to your local supermarket to select your next Green Valley entree." I'm sure people have had experience with this. You may even have your own examples of times you've complained and gotten something for free because of it. And of course, there's resale or sales promotions. So when the bad news isn't too devastating or it's not personal, reference to resale information or promotion can be appropriate. So something like, the computer workstations you ordered are unusually popular because of their stain, heat, and scratch resistant finishes. To help you locate hard to find accessories for these workstations, we invite you to visit our website where our online catalog provides a huge selection of surge suppressors, multiple outlet strips, security devices, and PC toolkits. So a promotion, right? You ordered this, or we can't give it to you right now because it's in high demand. But you know, if you go to our website, there's these other features or these other add-ons that you can look at. So really avoid endings that sound canned or insincere or inappropriate or self-serving. Don't invite further correspondence with the person. You don't want to hear from them again. That's why you need to be clear the first time so that no further correspondence is necessary. Don't say things like, "If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me." No, in bad news letters, you're sending the letter once it's over. So don't refer to the bad news in the end. Don't say, "Oh yeah, and this." So don't refer to that at the end. Just close because it's done. All right. And speaking of done, we are done this video lecture. So thank you for watching.